The story begins not with the light of day, but in the dim corridors of a fortress where silence is rarely pure. It is a silence broken by muffled cries, by whispers that seem to crawl along the cold stone walls, by the scratching of rats in the shadows. Imagine a castle perched on a lonely hill, its towers looming against the pale Hungarian moon, a place where peasants feared to tread after dusk. To the villagers who lived in its shadow, the castle was less a home and more a prison of unspeakable secrets. They told stories in hushed voices of what happened within those walls. Stories of girls who went in and never returned. Stories of screams carried by the wind, rising above the howling of wolves in the Carpathian night. And at the center of those whispers was a woman, a noble, a countess, a queen in her own right, whose name would echo through centuries as a creature of blood and terror. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory. To her enemies, she was the Blood Countess. To folklore, she became a vampire in human form. And to history, she is remembered as one of the most prolific female killers to have ever lived. Though whether that reputation is deserved or carefully constructed remains the very heart of this mystery. The legend is lurid, unforgettable. A beautiful noblewoman so obsessed with youth and beauty that she bathed in the blood of virgins, believing it would keep her young forever. A woman who tortured servants, mutilated peasants, and consorted with witches to preserve her own power. A woman whose cruelty was matched only by her elegance, whose noble lineage shielded her for years until her crimes became too horrific to ignore. It is the kind of tale that feels too grotesque to be true, and yet too powerful to dismiss as mere fantasy. But the story of Elizabeth Bathory is not simply a tale of monstrous appetites. It is a collision of myth and history, of politics and superstition. It is a story forged in a land torn by war, where noble families vied for survival, where the line between accusation and reality was blurred by ambition. And so we must ask, was Elizabeth Bathory truly the sadistic killer painted by legend, or was she the victim of a carefully orchestrated smear campaign designed to strip her of power and seize her vast fortune? Was she a bloodthirsty monster, or merely a woman crushed beneath the weight of rumor and fear? To step into her world, we must first strip away centuries of embellishment, peeling back the Gothic veil to see what remains in the historical record. We must enter the candlelit halls of her castle, stand at the foot of her bedchamber where her enemies' claimed bodies once lay, and listen closely to the testimonies written down by men with everything to gain from her downfall. This is a journey into darkness, not only of one woman's life, but of the human imagination itself. Picture the opening scene, a young servant girl trembling as she carries water up the spiral staircase of Cactus Castle. Her footsteps echo. The candle flickers in her hand. Behind the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs waits her mistress, a countess draped in black velvet, her pale face illuminated by firelight. The girl bows, but her hands shake. She has heard the rumors, and she knows that one wrong move could cost her everything. In some versions of the tale, it is here, in such small moments, that Bathory's cruelty reveals itself. A slap, a lash, a punishment for some trivial mistake. In others, it is far worse, blood spilled, flesh cut, screams smothered by stone walls. And yet, if we look beyond the legend, we find a different portrait. A noble woman born into immense wealth, highly educated in a time when most women were not, politically connected, fluent in several languages, even skilled in managing estates during her husband's long absences. A woman respected by peers, until suddenly she was not. How does such a woman become a monster in the eyes of history? This is the tension that grips us. For more than 4 centuries, her story has been told in 2 voices, one of horror and one of skepticism. On the one hand, the chronicles of the time accuse her of slaughtering hundreds of girls, of bathing in blood, of invoking Satan himself. On the other, modern historians remind us that she was a powerful widow in a patriarchal society, controlling vast lands that others coveted. They remind us that torture and execution were everyday realities of early modern Europe, and that noble families often became targets of elaborate political schemes. And so, in this investigation, we will not only trace the grisly details of the so-called Blood Countess, but also examine the machinery that created her legend. We will walk through the candlelit halls of Cactus, hear the cries of the accused, and question whether those cries were ever real. We will see how her image transformed across centuries. First a cautionary tale whispered among peasants, then a Gothic icon of eternal youth, and now a cultural symbol woven into vampire lore. Tonight, we embark on a journey not only into Elizabeth Bathory's castle, but into the very shadows of human history, where truth and myth are bound together by fear, power, and blood. Was she truly the queen who bathed in blood to stay young? Or is that image itself a mask, painted on by centuries of fear and imagination? As we follow her life, her crimes, and her legend, the answer will not be so simple. The deeper we go, the darker it becomes. And by the end, perhaps we will discover that the truth is far more unsettling than the legend itself. To understand Elizabeth Bathory, we must first step back into the world she inherited, a world that was already steeped in blood and fear long before her name became synonymous with cruelty. Hungary at the end of the 16th century was a land divided, scarred by endless conflict and haunted by the shadow of the Ottoman Empire. The very soil of the kingdom was a battlefield, where castles doubled as fortresses and peasants lived under constant dread of invasion, taxation, and the whims of lords who wielded almost godlike power over their lives. This was not a gentle renaissance of art and philosophy, but a harsh frontier society where brutality was ordinary and survival often demanded cruelty. In the east, the mighty Ottoman Turks pressed against the borders, eager to expand their empire deeper into Europe. In the west, the Habsburg monarchy sought to hold Hungary as a bulwark, turning noble families into both warriors and pawns. Between these two colossal forces stood the Hungarian nobility, proud, ambitious, and accustomed to wielding life and death over those below them. It was a crucible of violence, and into this crucible Elizabeth was born. The Bathory family was one of the most powerful dynasties in the region. Their lands stretched across Transylvania and Hungary, their wealth immense, their political influence undeniable. They were deeply tied to the great conflicts of their day, and they were not strangers to bloodshed. Some branches of the family produced renowned soldiers and statesmen. Others were whispered to have dabbled in the occult. For centuries, peasants spoke the name Bathory with both awe and fear, knowing that the family's favor, or their wrath, could shape entire villages' destinies. Life for the common people under the nobility was unforgiving. Serfdom bound them to the land, and failure to obey even the smallest command could mean savage punishment. Torture, flogging, and execution were not aberrations. They were daily realities. When a noblewoman like Elizabeth allegedly struck a servant girl or punished a maid, this was not considered unusual in her time. The line between discipline and cruelty was often blurred, though later historians would claim that Elizabeth crossed that line in ways no one else dared. But to understand how such claims took root, we must first see how violence was embedded in the very structure of her society. Religion added yet another layer of fear. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation divided communities, while witchcraft accusations spread through Europe like wildfire. In Hungary, belief in the supernatural was deeply entwined with daily life. Illness was explained as a curse, a bad harvest as the work of witches, and noble families often sought the counsel of mystics and healers. Against this backdrop, it is not surprising that Elizabeth's later association with witches, alchemists, and healers would darken her reputation, painting her not merely as cruel, but as unholy. Meanwhile, the noble courts themselves were hotbeds of intrigue. Rival families competed for power, forming alliances one year and turning on each other the next. A noblewoman of Elizabeth's rank was not only expected to bear children and manage estates. She was also a political actor, someone whose very presence at court could tip the balance of influence. The more wealth and land she controlled, the greater the risk that she would become a target. It is in this volatile world that Elizabeth's story unfolds. Her family's influence placed her at the heart of the kingdom's struggles. Her uncle, Stephen Bathory, rose to become the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, a ruler of vast territories and formidable power. Her relatives held positions of authority across Hungary and Transylvania, securing the Bathory legacy for generations. Elizabeth was not merely a noblewoman. She was a symbol of one of the most dominant dynasties in Central Europe. Yet with power came danger. The nobility's dominance over their serfs was absolute, but their own power was always vulnerable to the crown or to rival houses. A single accusation of treason, heresy, or corruption could destroy even the greatest family. When Elizabeth would later be accused of monstrous crimes, it was against this backdrop of political tension. She was a widow controlling vast estates at a time when Hungary was desperate for strong alliances and when powerful men coveted her lands. In such a world, justice was not impartial. It was a weapon wielded to eliminate enemies and seize power. But before Elizabeth became the infamous Blood Countess, she was simply a child of this turbulent land, raised in castles that overlooked battle-scarred fields, where gallows stood as grim reminders of the nobility's control. She would have witnessed executions as a normal part of life, seen peasants punished for theft or disobedience, and grown up surrounded by stories of war, witches, and demons. This environment did not merely shape her. It created the conditions in which her legend could take root. The peasants of Hungary already lived in terror of their lords, and whispers of cruelty traveled quickly from hearth to hearth. When strange things happened, when girls vanished, when screams echoed from a distant castle, superstition filled in the blanks. The legend of Elizabeth Bathory as a blood-drinking monster was not conjured out of thin air. It was built upon centuries of fear, upon the brutality of feudal life, and upon the precarious balance of power in a kingdom caught between two empires. And so the stage was set. A land steeped in war, a family steeped in power, and a society steeped in violence. From this soil grew the figure of Elizabeth Bathory, who would later be accused of the most grotesque crimes ever laid at the feet of a woman. But was she truly a reflection of her world's brutality, or was she a scapegoat crushed beneath it? The answer begins in her childhood, where the first shadows of the legend begin to emerge. Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 into a family whose name already carried both reverence and fear. The castle walls that sheltered her from the world were thick and cold, a fortress of stone and shadow where whispers of cruelty and tales of heroism coexisted in uneasy harmony. From the beginning, her life was shaped by the weight of expectation, by the legacy of the Bathory name, and by the harsh realities of a world where nobility could command armies and lives with equal ease. She was the daughter of a family that prided itself on honor, lineage, and power, but power, as often happens, can become a double-edged sword. From a young age, Elizabeth displayed intelligence and curiosity uncommon even among the elite. Tutors taught her languages, mathematics, history, and the arts, while her childhood playmates learned lessons of obedience and hierarchy. But alongside this cultivated sophistication, there were early signs of temperament and cruelty that would later feed the legend. Stories survive, though often fragmentary and exaggerated, that she punished animals harshly, tormented servants with small acts of violence, and exhibited a fascination with the darker sides of human nature. In an age when strict discipline was expected, these tendencies may have seemed only marginally unusual, but they hinted at the intensity of her will and the ruthless streak that would define her adult life. Her marriage at the age of 15 to Ferenc Nadasdy, a man 15 years her senior, was arranged not for love, but for alliance. Nadasdy, a distinguished military commander known as the Black Knight of Hungary, had fought valiantly against the Ottoman forces and carried a reputation that sent shivers through his enemies. To Elizabeth, he represented both a protector and a master, a figure who would shape the next chapter of her life. In the shadow of the fortress where she had grown up, She learned quickly that power could be both exhilarating and dangerous, and that alliances could turn as swiftly as a sword in battle. As a young bride, Elizabeth's life was a balance between obedience and autonomy. Her husband was often away on campaigns, leaving her in charge of managing vast estates, supervising servants, and maintaining the family's political connections. In these moments of solitude, the first true seeds of her infamous reputation began to grow. Accounts suggest that her treatment of servants became more severe, her punishments increasingly inventive, and her fascination with control and obedience absolute. Whether these stories are entirely true or have been exaggerated by later chroniclers remains a matter of debate, but the pattern is clear. Elizabeth's power, once exercised on a small scale in childhood, now extended over hundreds of lives. Yet, even in the earliest years, there were hints of vulnerability beneath her formidable presence. Her health was fragile, and she suffered from a condition, possibly epilepsy, that may have caused seizures and episodes of disorientation. In a time when illness could be interpreted as a sign of divine favor or damnation, this vulnerability may have fed both her inner fears and the suspicions of those around her. She was, at once, a woman of immense potential and one whose very body seemed at odds with the fears she carried within. Her adolescence and early adulthood were also punctuated by tragedy and isolation. Childhood friends passed away, siblings were lost to disease or conflict, and the political pressures of her family's prominence weighed heavily upon her. It was a world in which even a noble woman's life could be uncertain, where every move was scrutinized, and where rumors of cruelty, of strange behavior, of interest in forbidden arts, could take root and grow like ivy along stone walls. These formative years laid the psychological foundation for what later became legend. A woman capable of remarkable intelligence and ambition, but also a capacity for cruelty that history would remember, rightly or wrongly, in terrifying detail. Despite these pressures, Elizabeth was far from powerless. She inherited not just wealth, but the ability to navigate complex social hierarchies with remarkable skill. She understood the importance of alliances, the nuances of family politics, and the leverage that could be gained from careful manipulation of those around her. Her education, her status, and her intellect combined to make her a formidable figure, even at a young age. Those who underestimated her would later learn that behind her noble demeanor lay a sharp, calculating mind, a woman who would not tolerate disrespect or disobedience lightly. It was during these years that the first shadows of the legend began to form. Tales of missing servants, of strange punishments, and of whispered cruelty began circulating among the people who served her. Some accounts claim that she derived satisfaction from the fear she inspired, from the absolute obedience her presence demanded. Others suggest that these were exaggerations, fictions created by enemies who feared the power of a woman able to command so much in a patriarchal society. The truth, as is so often the case, lies somewhere in the murky intersection of fact, rumor, and the dark imagination of those who survived her household. Elizabeth's youth was a crucible, shaping both the woman she would become and the legend that would follow. She learned early that beauty, intellect, and power were intertwined, and that the maintenance of these qualities could inspire admiration and terror. Within the quiet halls of her home, beneath the stone towers and thick tapestries, a narrative was forming. One of a noble woman who could command fear as easily as loyalty, who could charm the elite and terrify the lowborn, and whose story would one day echo far beyond the walls of her castle. By the time she reached adulthood, Elizabeth Bathory was no longer simply a noble girl of great lineage. She was a woman poised to become a symbol. The lines between reality and myth were beginning to blur, and the first seeds of the infamous blood countess were being sown in whispers, rumors, and the quiet terror of those who worked in her household. Her youth, her intelligence, and her ruthlessness converged to create a figure that would haunt history for centuries. And as we trace her journey from child to legend, it becomes clear that the darkness surrounding her life was not sudden. It had been slowly, deliberately shaped from the very beginning. Elizabeth Bathory's marriage to Ferenc Nadasdy in 1575 marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would intertwine love, power, and the first murmurs of fear that would follow her for centuries. Nadasdy was no ordinary nobleman. Known as the Black Knight of Hungary, he had gained renown for his campaigns against the Ottoman Empire, where he displayed a ruthlessness and cunning that both inspired loyalty and struck terror into the hearts of his enemies. His very name carried the weight of battlefield glory, the smell of gunpowder, and the reputation of a man unafraid to spill blood when necessary. To be his wife was to enter a world of both privilege and peril. The marriage itself was not born of affection, at least not initially. Like many noble unions of the time, it was arranged for strategic advantage. Elizabeth's family sought to strengthen their political ties and consolidate influence over vast territories. Nadasdy's family sought an alliance that would bolster their position within the volatile hierarchy of Hungarian nobility. At 15, Elizabeth was thrust into a role that required poise, intelligence, and the ability to navigate the treacherous waters of aristocratic expectation. She was young, yet already seasoned by the demands of her upbringing, her mind sharpened by education and observation. Ferenc Nadasdy was often away at war, leading campaigns against the encroaching Ottomans or defending the borders of his estates from rival lords. In his absence, Elizabeth assumed control over their households, a position of immense authority and responsibility. She oversaw vast numbers of servants, managed finances, and ensured that her estates remained profitable and secure. It was in these moments of autonomy that the first seeds of her notorious reputation began to manifest. Orders that were once small commands now carried weight over hundreds of lives. Punishments, already a part of noble household management, became more creative, more exacting, and in some accounts, terrifying. Stories survive of young girls sent to her care who would later recount minor cruelties, lashings, confinement, or humiliations designed to enforce obedience. While it is impossible to separate truth from embellishment, a pattern emerges. Elizabeth's fascination with control and obedience intensified, not diminished, as her power grew. The household became a microcosm of her authority, a place where fear and respect were entwined. To those who witnessed her discipline firsthand, she could appear merciless. To those who heard only rumor, she could appear monstrous. The castle itself mirrored her growing authority. Nadasdy's military campaigns had left Elizabeth largely in charge of the estates, allowing her to transform the residence into a center of both efficiency and intimidation. Servants learned to anticipate her moods, to obey without hesitation, and to fear any perceived slight. Reports suggest that her punishments were not random, but meticulously calculated, designed to reinforce her dominance. Whether these tales are entirely accurate or partly fabricated, they contributed to the aura of fear surrounding her household and planted the early roots of the legend that would later define her life. Yet, Elizabeth's life was not solely consumed by cruelty or power. She was deeply aware of her role in a male-dominated society and learned to wield both intellect and charm as weapons. Letters and accounts from her correspondences suggest a woman capable of diplomacy, strategy, and foresight. She navigated the complex social hierarchies of Hungarian nobility with remarkable skill, leveraging connections and alliances to secure her family's position. In a world where wealth and land could make one a target, her ability to command respect was as vital as any sword or army. Nadasdy's influence on Elizabeth is a study in contrasts. On one hand, he provided a model of martial authority and discipline, showing her the power of fear and respect. On the other hand, his frequent absences left her with both freedom and isolation, a combination that historians suggest may have allowed darker tendencies to flourish unchecked. While he returned periodically to witness her management of the estates, it is unclear how much he interfered with her household practices. His trust in her abilities, combined with his absence, placed Elizabeth in a position of near absolute power, a circumstance that both enabled her achievements and allowed the seeds of her infamous legend to grow. The couple had children, as was expected of nobility, securing the continuation of their families and their political legacies. Yet even here, the harsh realities of their world were evident. Childhood mortality was high, and the pressures on a noblewoman to produce heirs could be immense. Elizabeth faced these pressures with both resilience and determination, further honing the qualities that would later define her rule over her estates: decisiveness, authority, and a keen awareness of human behavior. Beyond the walls of her household, the political landscape remained perilous. Hungary was still under threat from the Ottomans, while rival noble families constantly sought to undermine each other's power. The Black Knight himself had enemies, and by extension, so did Elizabeth. In this volatile environment, rumors about cruelty, about occult practices, even about murder, could serve as weapons as easily as swords. Her growing reputation, whether deserved or fabricated, became a tool and a shield, marking her as both formidable and feared. By the time Nadesty died in 1604, Elizabeth was no longer a young bride. She had become a widow in control of immense lands and responsibilities, with a reputation already tinged by rumor and fear. The freedom she experienced during his absence, combined with the pressures of political and social survival, had set the stage for the next phase of her life, a phase in which legend, horror, and history would converge. Her transformation from a noble girl under the shadow of her father to the ruler of her estates in her husband's absence illustrates the delicate balance of power, fear, and survival in early modern Hungary, a balance that would ultimately shape both her life and her enduring legend. It was here, in the years of her marriage and its aftermath, that Elizabeth Bathory learned the intoxicating combination of authority and isolation. These were the circumstances that allowed her intellect, ambition, and ruthlessness to flourish, and perhaps the same circumstances that would later make her the most feared and most misunderstood woman in Hungarian history. The Black Knight's shadow loomed over her life long after he was gone, a presence that shaped the woman who would become infamous as the Blood Countess. Perched high upon the jagged slopes of the Little Carpathians, Cactus Castle looms like a sentinel over the surrounding valleys, its weathered stones whispering secrets of centuries long past. From a distance, it could almost be mistaken for a romantic relic, a picturesque reminder of medieval architecture. Yet up close, it is anything but inviting. The walls are cold, rough-hewn, and imbued with a sense of foreboding that seems to seep from the very rock on which it stands. For those who lived under its shadow, the castle was not a home. It was a prison, a place where whispers of fear and cruelty passed like wind among the villagers and servants alike. Elizabeth Bathory made this fortress her dominion, a place where her authority was absolute and her reputation began to crystallize into legend. The castle was more than stone and timber. It was a labyrinth of corridors, hidden chambers, and narrow staircases that seemed to twist upon themselves. Guards, servants, and guests alike would navigate its halls with caution, ever aware that a misstep, a misworded phrase, or a simple glance could draw the Countess's attention and, in some tales, her wrath. Even in her early years at Cactus, the castle became a symbol of her power. Isolation, authority, and the tantalizing edge of danger all bound into one impenetrable fortress. To enter the castle was to step into a world where shadows moved as if alive. The main hall echoed with the sounds of clanging metal, hurried footsteps, and the distant laughter or screams of servants. The thick tapestries that lined the walls were not merely decorative. They were practical, muffling sound and hiding secret passages. Windows were few and narrow, allowing the harsh sunlight to penetrate only in slices, leaving much of the castle in permanent twilight. The atmosphere was a constant reminder to all who lived there. Here, one was never fully safe, yet one was always observed. The castle's remote location further amplified its sense of dread. It was a fortress cut off from the outside world, surrounded by dense forests where wolves prowled and the wind howled like the cries of unseen spirits. Villagers below spoke in hushed tones of lights flickering in the towers at odd hours, of figures moving behind the narrow windows, and of screams carried on the wind, whether real or imagined. To the peasantry, Cactus was more than a noble residence. It was a place where normal rules did not apply, where fear and superstition intertwined, and where the Countess herself seemed to embody the darkness that clung to the stone walls. Within these walls, Elizabeth exercised meticulous control. Her daily routines were punctuated by inspection of the servants, management of the household, and oversight of the estate's numerous properties. She established strict hierarchies, and the punishment for disobedience were both immediate and memorable. Tales describe servants who vanished from the household for minor infractions, only to return bruised, frightened, or permanently scarred. Whether these accounts are entirely accurate or exaggerated by rumor, they serve to reinforce her image. A woman whose reach extended into every corner of her domain, whose will was law, and whose presence inspired both respect and terror. The castle's architecture seemed to reflect Elizabeth herself, complex, imposing, and filled with secrets. Hidden chambers allowed her to move unseen, to observe without being observed, and to maintain control over those under her authority. Staircases twisted unpredictably, corridors narrowed and widened, and doors led to unexpected places, creating a sense of constant uncertainty for anyone unfamiliar with the layout. This physical labyrinth mirrored the psychological one that Elizabeth cultivated within her household. Obedience was mandatory, fear was a tool, and loyalty was constantly tested. Stories of supernatural occurrences within Cactus also began to take root during Elizabeth's time. Servants and local villagers spoke of shadows that moved independently, of strange lights at night, and of sounds that could not be explained. Some claimed that the castle was cursed, that it had absorbed the violent history of its lords and radiated it outward. Whether the origins of these tales lay in genuine experiences, collective fear, or deliberate exaggeration, they added a layer of legend to the fortress that would endure long after Elizabeth's death. The castle was not merely a backdrop to her life. It was an active participant in the shaping of her mythos. Cactus also served as a center for social and political gatherings. Nobles traveled from afar to meet with the Countess, and the castle's halls echoed with discussions of alliances, marriages, and territorial disputes. Elizabeth's presence was commanding. Her intelligence, charm, and sometimes chilling demeanor ensured that she was taken seriously among the elite. Yet beneath the formalities, the whispers persisted. Stories of cruelty and strange practices began to circulate beyond the castle walls, entering the realms of rumor and folklore, blending with the political machinations of rival families who saw advantage in exaggerating her reputation. The fortress became a stage on which legend and reality converged. It was a place of immense wealth and refinement, but also one of fear and suspicion. Servants walked its corridors with careful attention, peasants avoided its shadow, and nobles approached its gates with both respect and apprehension. The stone walls bore silent witness to the daily exercise of authority, the occasional excess of punishment, and the rumors that would one day elevate Elizabeth Bathory to her notorious status as the Blood Countess. By the time she was fully established at Cactus, Elizabeth's presence and the castle's foreboding aura had merged into a single, almost mythical entity. The fortress was not merely where she lived. It was where the legend of her cruelty took tangible form. Every echoing corridor, every hidden chamber, every flickering candle became part of the narrative that would captivate and horrify for centuries. To understand Elizabeth Bathory, one must understand Cactus, not just as a place of residence, but as a crucible of power, fear, and the earliest seeds of legend, where history and myth began their uneasy dance. Even before the tales of bloodbaths and unimaginable cruelty took hold in the imagination of later centuries, whispers began to spread within and beyond the walls of Cactus Castle. These were not official accusations, not yet written in the formal language of legal proceedings, but murmurs among servants, travelers, and villagers, rumors that hinted at a darkness simmering beneath Elizabeth Bathory's noble veneer. Fear travels faster than truth, and in the isolated valleys surrounding the fortress, every unexplained disappearance, every sudden scream, became a thread woven into the growing tapestry of dread. Servants were the first to speak in hushed tones. Their voices trembled as they described punishments that went beyond the ordinary discipline of a noble household. Girls who disobeyed, even in minor ways, were said to be confined for hours in darkness, beaten until their limbs were bruised, or subjected to humiliations that left lasting psychological scars. While some accounts may have been exaggerated, it is clear that Elizabeth exercised control with an intensity few could match. The combination of her beauty, her intelligence, and her commanding presence left a strong impression. And when fear accompanies power, stories of cruelty can quickly take root. Travelers and local villagers added their own layers to the growing narrative. Tales of children who entered the castle to serve as maids or companions and never returned began circulating in the surrounding towns. Mothers whispered warnings to their daughters. Neighbors spoke of faint, echoing screams carried down from the fortress by the wind. The line between fact and imagination blurred. A servant's punishment could be retold in the marketplace and embellished with every telling. And yet, beneath the exaggeration, there was an undeniable sense that Cactus was a place where fear lived as tangibly as the stone walls themselves. In some accounts, Elizabeth's cruelty extended beyond mere punishment into what would later be described as sadistic experimentation. Servants claimed that she tested the limits of human endurance, observing reactions to pain, confinement, and humiliation. Others claimed she was fascinated with the power of fear itself, noting how obedience could be earned not only through kindness or reward, but through terror. To those within the household, she was both a provider and a judge, a woman who maintained order with meticulous precision, but whose methods were rumored to be far from ordinary. Local folklore began to entwine with these early allegations. Superstitions in Hungary were deeply rooted, and strange occurrences were often explained through the lens of witchcraft, curses, or demonic influence. Tales of Elizabeth consulting with mystics and alchemists to enhance her power, stories of rituals and potions, began to circulate. Whether these tales were based in reality or were products of rumor and fear, they contributed to the perception that her household was not only a place of authority, but of unnatural, possibly unholy, influence. At the same time, the political landscape provided fertile ground for exaggeration and malice. Rival noble families, eager to undermine the Bathories, had motive to spread tales that cast Elizabeth in a sinister light. In a society where reputation was as vital as land and titles, a whisper of cruelty could serve as a potent weapon. Allegations that might have been minor or anecdotal were amplified, repeated, and eventually immortalized in chronicles that depicted her as a woman who delighted in the suffering of others. The truth, obscured by fear and ambition, began to harden into legend. Among these early allegations, one recurring theme stands out: Elizabeth's obsession with youth and beauty. Even before the notorious stories of blood-bathing emerged, there were hints that she sought ways to preserve her appearance, to maintain the elegance and vitality demanded of a noblewoman. Servants whispered that she experimented with herbs, tinctures, and other remedies, some mundane, some rumored to be sinister. In a culture where appearance and social standing were inseparable, these practices were often interpreted through the lens of superstition, transforming routine self-care into a narrative of obsession and unnatural desire. Yet, despite these rumors, Elizabeth's public persona remained largely intact among her peers. She was admired for her intelligence, for her skill in estate management, and for the strategic alliances she maintained. Even as whispers of cruelty grew louder among servants and villagers, the nobility often regarded her with a mixture of respect and cautious fear. The duality of her reputation, esteemed by the powerful feared by the powerless, created a tension that would define her life. It was a tension that allowed the first stories of blood and horror to take root, to grow, and eventually to dominate the narrative of her existence. Historians suggest that these early allegations were crucial in shaping what would become the enduring myth of the Blood Countess. They reveal a pattern: isolated acts of cruelty or strict discipline, repeated and exaggerated in retelling, transformed over time into a legend of monstrous behavior. The psychological and social context: an isolated castle, a noblewoman with absolute authority, a superstitious populace, and rival families eager to exploit fear, created the perfect conditions for a narrative of terror to flourish. By the end of this period, Elizabeth Bathory was no longer merely a young noblewoman of intellect and beauty. In the eyes of those who whispered, watched, and feared, she was becoming something more. A shadow was forming around her, a shadow that would grow in the telling of stories, the recording of rumors, and the imagination of those who sought to explain the unknown with the language of horror. The first seeds of her legend had been sown, and from this point forward, reality and myth would begin their intricate, terrifying dance. Cactus Castle, with its twisting corridors, hidden chambers, and oppressive atmosphere, became the stage for these whispers to grow. Within its walls, fear was as much a presence as the stone itself, shaping behavior and perception alike. It was here that Elizabeth Bathory's life intersected with legend, where early allegations, whether grounded in fact, rumor, or political intrigue, laid the foundation for a reputation that would echo across centuries, transforming a noblewoman into a figure both horrifying and unforgettable. Among all the tales that swirl around Elizabeth Bathory, none has captured the imagination, or the horror, of historians, folklorists, and the public quite like the claim that she bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. The image is unforgettable: a pale, aristocratic woman steeped waist-deep in the crimson fluid of the innocent, a grotesque ritual performed in secret, hidden behind the cold walls of a remote castle. It is a story that blends horror with fascination, and it is this tale, more than any other, that has secured her place in both history and legend. Yet, as with much of Elizabeth's life, the line between fact and fiction is blurred. The earliest contemporary accounts, written during her lifetime and shortly after her arrest, provide tantalizing hints but are far from definitive. Witnesses describe horrific acts of torture, mutilation, and murder within her estates, but the specific claim of blood bathing appears more prominently in later retellings, particularly in 18th and 19th century accounts. These stories often reflect the Gothic imagination of those later periods, where historical figures were reshaped into monstrous icons for entertainment, morality tales, or political purposes. To understand the origins of the bloodbath legend, it is essential to examine both the social and the psychological context. Hungary in the early 17th century was a world in which superstition and science, faith and fear, were often inseparable. Alchemy, witchcraft, and folk remedies were widely practiced, and the line between medicine and magic was fluid. Remedies for youth and beauty often included bizarre ingredients, from herbs and potions to more sinister substances rumored to preserve vitality. In this environment, a noblewoman obsessed with appearance could easily become the subject of whispers, rumors, and eventually legends that cast her desires in the most horrifying terms. The first written descriptions of Elizabeth's alleged practices come from testimonies collected during the investigation led by royal commissioners after her arrest in 1610. Servants and witnesses recounted scenes of torture, confinement, and death, detailing injuries inflicted upon young girls who served in her household. While these accounts are undeniably gruesome, historians debate the reliability of the testimonies. Many of the witnesses had incentives to exaggerate, either to protect themselves from punishment or to curry favor with investigators. Others were coerced under threat of execution. The narratives, while shocking, must be read with a critical eye, recognizing the complex interplay of fear, power, and ambition that shaped them. The bloodbath story, more than any other, transformed Elizabeth from a powerful, sometimes cruel, noblewoman into a figure of pure horror. Symbolically, the act of bathing in blood represented an obsessive, almost supernatural desire to halt the passage of time, to seize control not only over servants and territory, but over the inevitability of mortality itself. This narrative tapped into deep-seated anxieties of the period: fear of female power, fear of sexual and social transgression, and fear of death and decay. In the collective imagination, the bloodbath became an allegory, a reflection of society's fascination and dread of women who wielded authority beyond traditional boundaries. Scholars today continue to debate whether Elizabeth ever engaged in such rituals or whether the story is a combination of rumor, misinterpretation, and deliberate embellishment. Some argue that it was a politically motivated smear designed to justify the confiscation of her vast estates and to neutralize her influence. Others contend that while she may have been guilty of extreme cruelty and even murder, the specific claim of bathing in blood was a later addition, amplified by Gothic literature and folklore. Either way, the legend has proven remarkably enduring, shaping the public perception of her for centuries and inspiring countless adaptations in literature, film, and popular culture. The mechanics of the bloodbath legend also reveal a pattern of human storytelling that transcends fact. Fear thrives in isolation, secrecy, and repetition, and Cactus Castle provided all three. Its remote location, labyrinthine architecture, and strict hierarchy of authority created an environment in which servants could vanish, misdeeds could occur unnoticed, and rumors could flourish. Any unexplained disappearance or injury could be interpreted through the lens of superstition, especially in a society already predisposed to interpret unusual events as signs of witchcraft or demonic activity. Moreover, the legend was fueled by the moral panic surrounding women in power. Elizabeth's education, independence, and control over her household made her an anomaly in a patriarchal society. Women who exercised authority were often portrayed as unnatural, and when misfortune or tragedy occurred under their watch, the tendency was to attribute it to moral corruption or supernatural influence. In this sense, the bloodbath legend can be seen as part of a broader cultural phenomenon, where fear of female agency was projected onto a single, high-profile figure. Art and literature further solidified the myth. Woodcuts, pamphlets, and later Gothic novels depicted her as a vampiric figure, a pale aristocrat immersed in the blood of young girls, eyes wide with madness and desire. These representations, though centuries removed from the historical events, reinforced the narrative, transforming her into an archetype of female monstrosity. Every retelling amplified the horror, embedding the image so deeply in cultural memory that separating historical reality from artistic embellishment became nearly impossible. Yet, beneath the myth, there remains a kernel of truth. Investigations found that numerous girls had suffered or died under her care, and while the exact numbers remain contested, estimates range from dozens to hundreds, there is evidence of extreme abuse and violence. Whether these acts included ritualized bathing in blood is unproven, but the underlying pattern of cruelty is historically credible. It is a story of power abused, of fear wielded as a weapon, and of a noblewoman whose control over life and death was absolute within her domain. The bloodbath legend, then, functions on multiple levels. It is horror, it is folklore, it is a reflection of societal anxieties, and it is rooted in a context of real human suffering. Its endurance owes as much to psychological fascination as to historical fact. By the time Elizabeth Bathory was imprisoned in 1610, the legend had already begun to eclipse the historical figure, ensuring that her name would be remembered not only as a countess of immense power, but as a figure whose actions and alleged rituals haunted the imagination of generations to come. In exploring the bloodbath, we are forced to confront the interplay between myth and history, cruelty and rumor, reality and imagination. It is a reminder that legends, particularly those steeped in horror, often reveal as much about the societies that create them as they do about the individuals at their center. Elizabeth Bathory's story challenges us to navigate these murky waters, to question the line between truth and myth, and to understand how a single figure can be transformed into an enduring symbol of terror. Whether she truly bathed in blood or not, the legend has left an indelible mark on history, one that continues to captivate, horrify, and inspire curiosity even 4 centuries later. By 1610, the whispers surrounding Elizabeth Bathory had grown into a storm. Tales of cruelty, torture, and murder had reached the ears of the Hungarian authorities, and the political climate was ripe for intervention. Hungary was a kingdom still recovering from decades of conflict with the Ottoman Empire, internal rebellions, and a delicate balance of power between noble families. In this tense environment, accusations against a wealthy and powerful widow could not be ignored. The stage was set for an investigation that would entwine justice, fear, and politics in ways that would forever shape Elizabeth's legacy. The first steps toward her arrest were both deliberate and clandestine. Authorities were keenly aware of Elizabeth's status. She was a member of one of the most influential families in the region, and any attempt to challenge her authority required careful planning. Letters were sent, orders quietly drafted, and investigators were dispatched under the guise of ordinary administrative duties. Yet beneath the official protocols lay a sense of urgency. Something extraordinary, terrifying, and potentially destabilizing had been reported from Cactus Castle. Witnesses were brought forward, primarily servants and lower-ranking household members, whose testimonies would form the backbone of the investigation. Their accounts were horrifying. Girls confined in dungeons, subjected to starvation, flogging, and worse. Descriptions of torture were graphic and meticulous, detailing implements, methods, and, in some cases, the motives attributed to the Countess. While historians debate the accuracy of these testimonies, many were likely coerced or influenced by fear. They nevertheless provide a glimpse into the environment of the castle and the perception of Elizabeth by those who lived and worked there. One of the most chilling aspects of the testimonies was the level of detail provided about the alleged murders. Witnesses spoke of girls dying under her supervision, some from beatings, some from neglect, and others under circumstances left deliberately vague but designed to suggest deliberate cruelty. Each narrative, whether entirely true or partially exaggerated, contributed to a portrait of Elizabeth as a woman capable of extraordinary brutality. The testimonies were compiled systematically, creating a record that would later serve both legal and propagandistic purposes. Political intrigue played a central role in the investigation. Elizabeth's vast estates and wealth were coveted by many, and rival noble families saw an opportunity to weaken the Bathory influence. Some historians argue that the charges may have been exaggerated, if not entirely fabricated, to justify the seizure of her property and neutralize her political power. In this context, fear and envy intertwined, and the line between justice and opportunism became dangerously thin. The investigation was as much about consolidating power as it was about addressing genuine crimes. Despite the gravity of the allegations, Elizabeth herself remained a figure of enigmatic composure. Reports suggest that she neither confessed nor fully defended herself in the conventional sense. Her intelligence and social acumen allowed her to navigate the early stages of the investigation with a measure of control, even as the net of legal scrutiny tightened around her. In some ways, her presence and demeanor only reinforced the aura of power and fear that had followed her for decades. The formal arrest was a carefully orchestrated event. Royal commissioners, accompanied by armed guards, traveled to Cactus Castle to take her into custody. The castle, designed for defense and isolation, could not shield her from the authority of the crown. On the day of her arrest, servants and witnesses watched as Elizabeth was escorted from her domain, her control over the household, over life and death, momentarily broken by forces greater than herself. The image of her leaving the castle, still commanding awe and terror, would become an enduring symbol in the retelling of her story. Once in custody, the process of gathering testimony intensified. Investigators employed methods that, by modern standards, would be considered coercive and brutal. Witnesses were threatened, some were promised clemency, and others were encouraged to embellish their accounts. The resulting depositions were filled with a mixture of factual observations, rumor, and fear-driven exaggeration. The systematic collection of these narratives created a document of horror, one that would be cited for centuries as evidence of Elizabeth's alleged crimes, even as questions about its reliability persisted. The political dimension of the trial cannot be overstated. Hungary was a kingdom in which noble power was both a necessity and a threat, and Elizabeth's wealth and influence made her a unique figure. The crown, seeking to assert authority and consolidate control, had a vested interest in curtailing the Bathory family's independence. By framing Elizabeth as a monster, the authorities could justify not only her imprisonment, but also the confiscation of her lands and titles. The line between genuine justice and calculated political maneuvering blurred, creating a trial that was as much about power as it was about morality or law. Throughout the investigation, the psychological dimension of the testimonies shaped public perception. Accounts of girls tortured and killed, of servants living in constant fear, and of a noblewoman obsessed with youth and beauty created a narrative that was impossible to ignore. Even without definitive proof of every act, the cumulative weight of the allegations cast Elizabeth as a figure beyond ordinary comprehension. A woman whose cruelty seemed almost supernatural, whose authority transcended normal societal boundaries, and whose presence inspired both fascination and horror. The culmination of these investigations was a meticulous compilation of testimonies, reports, and observations presented to the royal court. This body of evidence, while contested and debated by historians, solidified Elizabeth Bathory's reputation. It was a legal and narrative turning point. No longer was she simply a wealthy, powerful noblewoman. She had become the subject of an extraordinary narrative that fused historical fact, rumor, and the Gothic imagination. The arrest and the testimonies surrounding it also reveal the broader social anxieties of the time. They illustrate how fear, power, and gender intersected in early modern Europe. Women who wielded authority, particularly over life and death, were often cast as unnatural, dangerous, or even diabolical. In Elizabeth's case, the combination of wealth, independence, and alleged cruelty created a perfect storm for legend-making. The investigation, in its intensity and detail, reflects a society both fascinated and terrified by women who defied traditional roles. By the end of the investigation, Elizabeth Bathory was confined, her fate sealed not only by the legal machinery of the kingdom, but also by the stories that had grown around her. The testimonies, the arrests, and the political machinations ensured that her name would echo through history, both as a figure of immense historical interest and as a cautionary tale of power, fear, and human cruelty. In this chapter of her life, the interplay of reality and myth began to solidify, setting the stage for the enduring legend of the Blood Countess. The trial of Elizabeth Bathory was unlike any other in early 17th century Hungary. By the time she faced judgment, her reputation had already been shaped by decades of rumor, fear, and the grim testimonies gathered during the investigation. The charges were staggering: torture, murder, and the deliberate abuse of dozens, if not hundreds, of young girls under her care. Yet the trial was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a spectacle, a carefully orchestrated event that combined justice, fear, and political theater, reflecting both the anxieties of the kingdom and the extraordinary power of the woman at its center. The formal proceedings were conducted under intense scrutiny. Nobles, officials, and witnesses crowded into the chambers where Elizabeth was to be confronted. From the outset, the atmosphere was charged with tension. The castle and estate had long been symbols of her authority, but now she faced a system designed to strip her of control. Observers noted her composure, her deliberate movements, and the piercing intelligence behind her eyes, qualities that had long both fascinated and intimidated those around her. Even in this vulnerable moment, she remained a commanding presence. Witnesses were brought forward en masse, each recounting horrors that would later define her legend. They described girls confined in dungeons, subjected to unimaginable pain, and often left to die under neglect or cruelty. The testimonies were detailed, vivid, and terrifying, painting a portrait of a woman whose authority had been exercised without mercy. As the accounts unfolded, the distinction between historical fact and embellishment blurred. Fear and social pressure influenced the recollections of witnesses, and in a society where superstition and rumor were intertwined, the accounts took on an almost mythic quality. Political motives further complicated the trial. Elizabeth was a widow with immense estates and power, and her arrest provided an opportunity for the crown to assert control and for rival families to claim a portion of her wealth. The charges, while grounded in real allegations of abuse, were amplified by the ambitions of those seeking to weaken the Bathory influence. In this sense, the trial was as much about consolidating power and seizing property as it was about meting out justice. The spectacle of her prosecution reinforced the authority of the state while simultaneously feeding the growing legend of her cruelty. Throughout the trial, Elizabeth remained defiant. Reports suggest she never confessed to the most sensational charges, particularly the infamous tales of bathing in blood. She contested, questioned, and maintained a stoic presence, demonstrating an intelligence and cunning that left observers both wary and intrigued. Her demeanor, combining dignity and indifference, only heightened the sense of fear and fascination surrounding her. It was as if the courtroom, intended to diminish her power, instead amplified the aura that had followed her for decades. As the proceedings progressed, the weight of evidence, both factual and fabricated, mounted. The legal framework of the time allowed for testimonies obtained under duress, and in some cases, witnesses were coerced or incentivized to exaggerate. The resulting record presented a relentless narrative of horror, one that left little room for nuance or defense. The trial became a theater of morality, showcasing the consequences of cruelty while simultaneously enthralling the public with tales of unimaginable violence. Ultimately, the verdict was severe but calculated. Elizabeth Bathory was not executed, a decision influenced by her noble status, political connections, and the desire to avoid scandal. But she was condemned to life imprisonment. The sentence was designed to neutralize her power permanently, while simultaneously reinforcing the moral lesson of her alleged crimes. She was confined to a set of chambers in Cactus Castle, effectively isolated from the outside world, with her movements restricted and her interactions closely monitored. In this confinement, the legend of the Blood Countess would continue to grow, nourished by imagination as much as by fact. Her imprisonment was a psychological ordeal as much as a physical one. The chambers were austere, the windows narrow, and the walls thick, creating an environment in which time itself seemed to slow. Guards ensured that she could not escape. Visitors were limited, and the routines of daily life were stripped to their bare essentials. In many ways, Elizabeth remained in the fortress she had once ruled, but now the power had shifted entirely. She was surrounded by the very walls that had enabled her authority, yet she was rendered powerless within them. Isolation, however, did not erase her presence. Servants and guards who tended to her daily life described her as maintaining an air of dignity and authority even in confinement. Letters and reports from the time indicate that she remained sharp, alert, and aware of her surroundings, continuing to exert influence in subtle ways. In this paradoxical existence, she was both prisoner and legend, confined within stone walls yet free to dominate the imagination of those who knew her story. The trial and sentencing also reflect the broader social anxieties of early modern Europe. Women who wielded power, particularly over life and death, were often viewed with suspicion and fear. Elizabeth's intelligence, independence, and authority disrupted traditional gender norms, making her a target for both real and imagined accusations. In many ways, the trial functioned as a societal mechanism to reassert control over a woman who had defied conventional boundaries, using the law, spectacle, and rumor as instruments of containment. Even after her confinement, the psychological weight of the trial persisted. The stories that emerged from the courtroom, whether accurate, exaggerated, or fabricated, ensured that Elizabeth's reputation would endure far beyond her physical isolation. She became a symbol of terror, a figure whose alleged excesses and cruelty captured the collective imagination of Hungary and, eventually, the world. The trial, in essence, solidified her transformation from noblewoman to myth, creating a legacy that continues to fascinate and horrify centuries later. In reflecting on Elizabeth Bathory's trial and confinement, one is confronted with a complex interplay of fact, fear, and fiction. The legal process, while grounded in the reality of her abuses, was influenced by politics, superstition, and social norms. The resulting narrative of horror, blood, and tyranny was as much a product of societal anxieties as it was of her actions. Yet even as we dissect the truth from the legend, the image of the imprisoned countess remains powerful. A woman confined within stone walls, stripped of authority, yet forever commanding fear, curiosity, and morbid fascination. Ultimately, the trial and her subsequent imprisonment serve as a stark reminder of the fragility of power, the peril of rumor, and the enduring potency of legend. Elizabeth Bathory's life, once defined by authority and fear, became in her confinement a story told and retold, amplified by the imagination of generations. She was both a historical figure and a symbol, a cautionary tale and a mythic monster, whose chambers in Cactus Castle became the final stage of a life intertwined with horror, intrigue, and the relentless construction of a legend that would echo across the centuries. Elizabeth Bathory spent the last years of her life confined within the thick stone walls of Cactus Castle, removed from the world she had once ruled with authority, fear, and fascination. Stripped of power, her days became a monotonous rhythm of isolation and observation. The chambers that had once echoed with her commands now contained only silence, broken occasionally by the footsteps of guards and the hushed conversations of the few who attended her. In this confinement, the legendary figure of the Blood Countess was left alone with her thoughts, her body gradually succumbing to the inevitability of time. The exact circumstances of her death in 1614 are sparsely documented, but it is widely agreed that she died quietly, removed from public view, and without the dramatic finality that legend might suggest. The woman who had been the center of fear, fascination, and rumor passed away within the same fortress that had witnessed both her power and her downfall. Her death marked the end of a life shrouded in controversy, but did not mark the end of her story. Far from fading into obscurity, Elizabeth Bathory's legend grew in the centuries that followed, shaped by folklore, Gothic literature, and cultural fascination with female monstrosity. Almost immediately after her death, tales of her cruelty and alleged blood rituals began to solidify in the public imagination. Chroniclers, often writing decades or centuries later, emphasized the most sensational elements: bathing in blood, torture of young girls, and supernatural obsession with youth and beauty. These accounts, while often exaggerated or entirely fabricated, captured the moral imagination of Europe. In a society fascinated by the intersection of power, gender, and fear, Elizabeth became the embodiment of the ultimate transgressive woman, a noble whose actions defied both morality and natural order. The confiscation of her estates ensured that her family's influence diminished, but her name continued to evoke terror and curiosity. The dramatic nature of her alleged crimes, coupled with the isolation of her confinement and the political intrigue surrounding her trial, created the perfect foundation for myth-making. Each retelling added layers. Rumors became stories, stories became legends, and legends became enduring cultural symbols. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Elizabeth Bathory had been transformed in literature and art into a Gothic figure, a precursor to modern vampire myths, and an archetype of female horror. Folklore surrounding the Countess was enriched by regional superstition and the human tendency to narrativize fear. In the villages around Cactus, stories persisted of the castle's cursed corridors, of shadows that moved like living entities, and of cries that could be heard on windswept nights. These tales blurred the line between historical events and supernatural embellishment. By blending fact with fear, the collective imagination ensured that the legend of Elizabeth Bathory would endure far beyond the physical limitations of her life and death. Literature, art, and popular culture further cemented her image. Gothic novels, plays, and later films drew upon the most lurid details of her story, often portraying her as a vampiric figure obsessed with eternal youth. Pain, cruelty, and blood were amplified to serve moral, aesthetic, and entertainment purposes. Through these reinterpretations, Elizabeth transcended history to become a cultural icon, a symbol of both human fascination with evil and the anxieties of societies that struggled to reconcile female power with traditional gender norms. Modern historians continue to debate the balance between truth and exaggeration. Archival records confirm instances of abuse and the deaths of girls in her care, yet the more extreme claims, hundreds of victims, ritualized blood-bathing, are harder to substantiate. Scholars point out the influence of political motives, coercion during testimony, and the Gothic imagination of later chroniclers. These factors, combined with the natural human tendency to sensationalize, suggest that the legend is as much a product of cultural narrative as it is of historical fact. Yet even with questions of accuracy, the enduring fascination with Elizabeth Bathory speaks to larger truths about fear, power, and societal boundaries. Her story resonates because it intertwines historical cruelty with psychological horror, political intrigue with personal ambition, and isolation with myth-making. She is at once a real person and an archetype, a lens through which generations have explored the darker aspects of humanity, the terror of female authority, and the fascination with transgression. Her legacy also serves as a mirror of societal attitudes toward women in positions of power. The combination of beauty, intelligence, and autonomy, once admired in Elizabeth herself, was reframed posthumously as monstrous. Tales of blood and cruelty transformed a widow managing her estates into a figure who defied not only law but natural and moral order. This transformation reveals as much about the fears of early modern Europe as it does about Elizabeth's actual deeds, showing how history, legend, and cultural imagination intersect to create enduring narratives of horror. In the centuries that followed, Elizabeth Bathory became a cultural touchstone. Writers, filmmakers, and artists have revisited her story countless times, exploring themes of obsession, cruelty, power, and the supernatural. The narrative of the Blood Countess has evolved, absorbing elements of vampire lore, Gothic horror, and psychological intrigue. Each retelling reinforces the image of Elizabeth not just as a historical figure, but as a symbol of fear, of transgression, and of the dark allure of the forbidden. In death, Elizabeth Bathory achieved a form of immortality that no noble title or estate could have granted. While her body returned to the earth, her legend transcended time, continuing to captivate, terrify, and provoke reflection. She became a figure through which humanity examines its fascination with evil, its anxieties about power and gender, and its enduring love of story. The Countess, who once commanded a fortress and inspired terror in her household, now commands imagination across the centuries, a testament to the complex interplay of history, myth, and the human psyche. Elizabeth Bathory's final chapter reminds us that legends are not merely born from deeds, but from perception, fear, and cultural resonance. The woman who died in solitude within her castle became a symbol of horror, a cautionary tale, and a subject of endless fascination. Her death did not end the story. It transformed it, ensuring that the Blood Countess would continue to haunt the collective consciousness, a figure suspended between history and myth, forever entwined with the shadows of her castle, the whispers of the villages, and the imagination of the world. Elizabeth Bathory's story did not end with her death. If anything, her legend truly began to flourish in the centuries that followed. The chilling tales of her cruelty, blood rituals, and obsessive pursuit of eternal youth became a fertile ground for folklore across Central Europe. Villagers spoke in hushed tones of the Blood Countess, warning children to behave lest she come for them in the night. Cactus Castle, perched atop its hill like a sentinel of terror, became a locus for ghost stories, local superstition, and the collective imagination of a people eager to narrativize fear. Shadows in the castle corridors, inexplicable cries in the night, and the unexplained disappearances of children, real or imagined, fed the legend, blending historical events with supernatural embellishments. By the 18th century, the figure of Elizabeth Bathory had crossed the threshold from history into Gothic folklore. Chroniclers and storytellers added layers to her narrative, portraying her as a vampire-like figure who bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. These accounts, often sensationalized and removed from historical accuracy, transformed her image into one of ultimate transgression, a woman who defied not only moral law but natural law itself. In Central Europe, the figure of the vampiric countess merged seamlessly with existing folklore about the undead, blood-sucking spirits, and cursed nobles, cementing her place in the broader mythological landscape. The literary world embraced her story with gusto. Writers of Gothic fiction in the 18th and 19th centuries found in Elizabeth Bathory a perfect embodiment of horror and excess. Novels, plays, and pamphlets emphasized the blood rituals, her obsessive vanity, and her unrelenting cruelty. Authors amplified her cruelty into archetypal terror, the powerful, beautiful, and immortal woman whose desire for eternal youth led her to commit unspeakable acts. Through literature, Elizabeth became not merely a historical figure, but a symbol of humanity's fascination with evil, the dangers of obsession, and the allure of forbidden power. Her influence extended beyond literature into art and visual culture. Illustrations, woodcuts, and later paintings depicted Elizabeth in scenes of grotesque indulgence, often emphasizing her aristocratic beauty juxtaposed with acts of cruelty. Artists depicted her poised over young girls, dripping with blood, a haunting embodiment of both fear and fascination. These visual representations reinforced her mythic status, ensuring that even those who never read a historical account or Gothic novel could encounter the terror of the Blood Countess through imagery. With the rise of the modern vampire myth in the 19th and 20th centuries, Elizabeth Bathory's legend merged seamlessly with popular culture. She became a precursor to literary and cinematic vampires, influencing works from Bram Stoker's Dracula to contemporary films and series. The image of the aristocratic, predatory female who sustains herself with the life force of the young and innocent echoed across stories of immortality, bloodlust, and Gothic horror. In this way, the historical figure of Elizabeth Bathory became inseparable from the archetype of the vampiric woman, a symbol that continues to shape contemporary horror narratives. Folklorists note that her story also reveals cultural anxieties about women, power, and sexuality. Elizabeth's intelligence, autonomy, and authority defied traditional gender norms, making her a target for posthumous demonization. The bloodbath legend, with its emphasis on vanity, youth, and sexualized horror, transformed a powerful noblewoman into a cautionary figure, a warning against female transgression, obsession, and desire for control. Through folklore, literature, and myth, societies encoded their fears about women who defy societal expectations into the persona of Elizabeth Bathory. Modern scholarship has further examined the interplay between fact and fiction in her posthumous myth. While archival records confirm instances of cruelty and deaths under her supervision, the most extreme claims, hundreds of victims, ritualized blood bathing, remain historically unverified. Yet the persistence of these myths demonstrates the power of narrative. The stories themselves, whether true or fabricated, carry meaning. They reflect societal fascination with horror, obsession, and power, illustrating how legends can evolve independently of historical accuracy while still shaping cultural consciousness. In popular culture today, Elizabeth Bathory continues to captivate and terrify. Films, television series, novels, comics, and video games draw upon her image, often emphasizing her vampiric qualities and sadistic reputation. She has become an icon of Gothic horror, a symbol of obsession with beauty and immortality, and a figure through which creators explore the darker impulses of humanity. Her story resonates with audiences precisely because it straddles the line between historical reality and myth, allowing fascination, horror, and imagination to coexist. The enduring appeal of Elizabeth Bathory also lies in the psychological horror embedded in her legend. Tales of manipulation, cruelty, and the obsession with eternal youth speak to universal human fears. The fear of aging, of mortality, and of power corrupted. Unlike other historical figures who vanish into obscurity, Elizabeth remains vivid in the collective imagination because her story touches on anxieties that are timeless, transcending the historical moment of 17th century Hungary. Ultimately, the folklore and vampire myth surrounding Elizabeth Bathory illustrate how history and culture intertwine. The woman who lived, ruled, and allegedly committed atrocities in Cactus Castle became more than a historical figure. She became a vessel for storytelling, imagination, and moral caution. Across centuries, her legend has evolved, absorbing elements of horror, Gothic fantasy, and psychological intrigue, making her one of the most enduring and compelling figures in both history and myth. Elizabeth Bathory's cultural afterlife demonstrates the power of narrative to shape memory, identity, and fear. From regional superstition to global pop culture, from Gothic literature to cinematic horror, the Blood Countess has become an enduring symbol of human fascination with evil, the supernatural, and the dark side of desire. Her story is a reminder that legends are born not only from deeds, but from imagination, interpretation, and the timeless human need to explore the boundaries of morality, mortality, and power. In every retelling, Elizabeth Bathory endures, a figure both feared and revered, a historical countess whose shadow stretches far beyond her lifetime, and a mythic icon who continues to haunt the corridors of literature, folklore, and modern imagination. Elizabeth Bathory has fascinated historians, psychologists, and storytellers for centuries, not merely because of the alleged atrocities attributed to her, but because she embodies a profound and disturbing intersection of power, vanity, and cruelty. To examine her psychology is to peer into the mind of a woman shaped by privilege, violence, and isolation. A woman who, according to contemporary reports, wielded authority over life and death with a cold, calculating hand. But how much of her behavior was a reflection of her personality, and how much was amplified by fear, rumor, and the cultural imagination? From the earliest years of her life, Elizabeth was immersed in a world defined by rigid hierarchies, harsh discipline, and constant political intrigue. Born into one of Central Europe's most powerful noble families, she was educated in languages, literature, and the arts, but also exposed to violence, superstition, and cruelty as normal aspects of aristocratic life. Historians suggest that these formative experiences may have shaped a complex psyche, blending intellect and strategic thinking with an awareness of fear as a tool. The psychological imprint of witnessing punishment, executions, and political maneuvering likely contributed to a worldview in which power and control were paramount. Her marriage to Ferenc Nadasdy, the Black Knight of Hungary, introduced further psychological dynamics. On one hand, she was paired with a man whose reputation for martial prowess and ruthlessness offered both protection and a model of authority. On the other hand, Nadasdy's frequent absences left her isolated in managing vast estates, giving her unprecedented autonomy. Scholars have suggested that this combination of authority and isolation may have nurtured tendencies toward control and, potentially, cruelty. Elizabeth learned that she could command obedience and instill fear, and some psychological interpretations suggest she may have become fascinated by the ways in which dominance could be exercised, particularly over the powerless. The alleged obsession with youth and beauty, central to her later reputation, offers further insight into her psychological profile. Stories of blood bathing, while historically debated, symbolize a deeper preoccupation with mortality, vanity, and the desire to transcend the natural limits imposed by age. From a psychological perspective, such obsession may reflect anxiety about aging, fear of irrelevance, and an intense desire to maintain control over both body and perception. Even if the extreme acts attributed to her were exaggerated, contemporary accounts confirm that she valued beauty and youth, suggesting that these concerns were genuine and perhaps obsessive. Power, fear, and isolation formed a trifecta that defined much of Elizabeth's psychological landscape. Historical accounts portray her as highly intelligent, politically astute, and socially cunning. She understood how to manipulate social networks, correspond with allies, and maintain authority even in her husband's absence. This intelligence, however, may have been intertwined with a darker fascination with suffering and obedience. Eyewitness testimonies, though potentially biased or coerced, describe behaviors that suggest a meticulous attention to punishment, an interest in the responses of her victims, and a deliberate application of terror. Psychologists might interpret this as sadistic tendencies combined with a strategic understanding of human behavior, though whether this reached pathological levels remains debated. Another dimension to consider is the role of gender and societal expectation. Elizabeth's autonomy as a widow with control over extensive lands placed her outside the conventional roles prescribed to women of her time. Historians and psychologists alike have noted that women in positions of unusual power were often demonized, their behavior interpreted through lenses of fear and superstition. Some elements of Elizabeth's legend, the blood-bathing, ritual killings, and vampiric associations, may have been exaggerations amplified by societal discomfort with a woman exercising unmitigated authority. In this sense, psychological interpretations must account not only for her individual tendencies, but also for the cultural forces that magnified and distorted them. The interplay between cruelty and fascination is central to understanding her legend. Elizabeth appears to have been both intrigued and repelled by the suffering of others, a trait noted in contemporary accounts of her household. Modern psychological frameworks might consider traits such as narcissism, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and sadistic personality traits to explain certain patterns. Extreme attention to order, obsession with beauty and control, and potential gratification from the fear of others. Yet the evidence is filtered through centuries of rumor, making it difficult to disentangle historical fact from mythologized horror. It is also crucial to consider the possibility of trauma and desensitization. Raised in a society where punishment, cruelty, and brutality were normalized, Elizabeth may have developed a psychological resilience, or conversely, a desensitization, that allowed her to perceive acts of cruelty as tools rather than moral transgressions. In a feudal system where serfs could be whipped, confined, or executed at the whim of a noble, a young woman taught to value obedience and control may have internalized these methods as acceptable or even necessary. The psychological environment of fear and power undoubtedly influenced her behavior and the legend that would follow. Yet despite these considerations, Elizabeth remains an enigma. Was she a monstrous figure of pathological cruelty, a product of her environment whose actions were amplified by rumor and political motives, or a complex individual whose human traits, vanity, ambition, intelligence, were transformed into legend by the anxieties of her society? The psychological analysis cannot provide definitive answers, but it does illuminate the intricate web of personality, circumstance, and perception that surrounds her. Her enduring fascination lies partly in this ambiguity. Elizabeth Bathory embodies the intersection of human ambition, societal fear, and the darker impulses of the psyche. She is at once a historical figure, a psychological case study, and a mythic archetype. By examining her life through a psychological lens, we glimpse the complexities of power, the intoxicating allure of control, and the ways in which isolation, privilege, and societal pressures can shape human behavior, sometimes in forms both terrifying and captivating. In a final analysis, understanding Elizabeth Bathory psychologically is as much about understanding the society in which she lived as the woman herself. Her alleged crimes, her obsession with youth, and her reputed cruelty are inseparable from the context of a violent, patriarchal, and superstitious world. Yet the fascination with her persona persists precisely because she challenges simple categorization. A woman of intellect and power whose legend blurs the line between reality and myth, morality and monstrosity, history and imagination. Elizabeth Bathory's psychological portrait reminds us that human behavior cannot be divorced from context, that legend and perception shape historical memory, and that the darkest chapters of history often reveal as much about society as they do about the individuals at their center. In her, we see not just the Blood Countess, but a reflection of fear, ambition, and the haunting complexities of the human psyche. Elizabeth Bathory's story is not merely the tale of a noble woman accused of unspeakable crimes. It is a prism through which we can examine power, fear, and the enduring human fascination with darkness. Across centuries, she has been portrayed as a monstrous villain, a tragic figure, and even a mythic vampire, roles that reflect both historical reality and the collective imagination of society. Her life, steeped in privilege, authority, and the shadows of violence, became the foundation for a legend that continues to haunt cultural consciousness. To understand her, one must consider the world in which she lived. A society divided by war, superstition, and patriarchal norms shaped the opportunities, fears, and choices of its people. Elizabeth's actions, whether exaggerated or factual, cannot be fully separated from the environment that cultivated them. Power, isolation, and the ever-present threat of political intrigue forged a woman capable of commanding obedience, instilling fear, and navigating a perilous landscape with intelligence and cunning. Her story, therefore, is as much a reflection of early modern Hungary as it is of Elizabeth herself. Yet it is the interplay between fact and legend that has ensured her immortality. Reports of cruelty, torture, and blood-bathing captured imaginations long after her death, amplified by chroniclers, storytellers, and artists who sought to explore the extremes of human behavior. These tales, whether wholly true or largely mythologized, created an archetype, the female ruler who wields power with obsessive control, whose vanity and ambition cross moral boundaries, and whose actions challenge societal norms. In this way, Elizabeth became more than a historical figure. She became a symbol, a figure through which generations could examine the darker aspects of humanity. Her psychological complexity is central to her enduring fascination. Elizabeth Bathory was intelligent, observant, and strategic, yet her legend emphasizes obsession, cruelty, and a near supernatural preoccupation with youth. Psychologists and historians alike have debated the motives behind her alleged actions. Were they the products of pathological tendencies, a response to isolation and trauma, or a combination of environment and opportunity amplified by rumor? The truth likely lies somewhere in the interplay between individual psyche and societal context. This ambiguity allows her story to remain compelling, resisting simple categorization and inviting endless speculation. Culturally, the Blood Countess has evolved into a Gothic icon, a precursor to vampire lore, and a touchstone for horror fiction. Her image appears in literature, art, film, and digital media, each iteration emphasizing different facets of her legend. The obsessive noblewoman, the cruel tormentor, the immortal vampire. In every adaptation, She functions as a mirror of contemporary fears: fear of female authority, fear of aging, fear of the unknown. Through these stories, Elizabeth transcends history, becoming a figure that illuminates the psychological and moral anxieties of societies across time. Her legacy is also a lesson in the mechanics of myth-making. Political motives, exaggerations, and cultural discomfort with women in power converge to create the legend we know today. Whether or not she ever bathed in blood, the power of the narrative itself has ensured her place in history and imagination alike. This underscores a profound truth. Legends are shaped as much by society as by individual actions. Elizabeth's story demonstrates how fear, rumor, and fascination can transform a human life into myth, blurring the line between reality and imagination. The shadow of the Blood Countess endures not only in popular culture, but also in the collective consciousness. Visitors to Cactus Castle walk corridors that once echoed with the footsteps of her household, imagining the fears and intrigues that played out within its walls. Tales told in villages around the castle continue to merge historical memory with supernatural speculation. Each retelling reinforces her presence, ensuring that she remains not merely a footnote in history, but an ever-present specter of fascination, warning, and intrigue. In reflecting on Elizabeth Bathory's life, we are reminded that history is rarely simple. It is shaped by deeds, yes, but also by perception, context, and the human desire to explain the unexplainable. Elizabeth represents both a concrete historical figure and an enduring symbol of cruelty, of the corrupting potential of power, of the consequences of obsession, and of the deep-seated fears and fantasies of the societies that remember her. She embodies the tension between fact and myth, reality and imagination, morality and monstrosity. Ultimately, the Blood Countess is timeless because she embodies universal anxieties. Her legend touches on aging, mortality, vanity, authority, and the capacity for cruelty, all themes that resonate across eras and cultures. Whether seen as a monster, a misunderstood noblewoman, or a psychological case study, Elizabeth Bathory remains a compelling figure precisely because she challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, fear, and human nature. As centuries pass, the story of Elizabeth Bathory will continue to inspire fascination, terror, and scholarly debate. Her castle, her legend, and the myths surrounding her life are intertwined in a narrative that resists closure. She reminds us that some shadows never fully disappear, that some stories are too powerful to fade, and that the line between history and legend is often as fragile as it is enduring. In the end, the Blood Countess stands as both a historical enigma and a cultural icon. Elizabeth Bathory's life, her alleged crimes, and her posthumous legend compel us to explore the darkest corners of human imagination, the complex psychology of power, and the ways in which stories, true or not, can shape memory, culture, and fear. The shadow she cast in life stretches far beyond her death, echoing in every whispered story, every Gothic tale, and every fascination with the intersection of beauty, power, and horror. Her story endures, eternal, haunting, and impossible to forget. Even centuries after her death, Elizabeth Bathory's story refuses to rest quietly in history. The Blood Countess has transcended the boundaries of time, geography, and even genre, emerging as a figure of enduring fascination, fear, and speculation. She represents a rare convergence, a woman whose historical reality, psychological complexity, and mythological overlay intersect in ways that continue to captivate scholars, storytellers, and audiences alike. In her, the past lives on, not merely as record, but as legend, a reminder of the human impulse to explore darkness in others and, in doing so, reflect upon our own. The final chapter of her legacy lies in the interplay between imagination and reality. Elizabeth's life, full of authority, intrigue, and alleged cruelty, provide the canvas upon which societies have projected their deepest anxieties about aging, female power, obsession, and mortality. Legends of her blood rituals, once whispered among villagers, transformed into Gothic tales, novels, and cinematic portrayals that shaped the collective imagination. In each retelling, her persona adapts, reflecting the values, fears, and curiosities of the time while preserving the core fascination. A woman who sought to define nature, morality, and death itself. Elizabeth's story also serves as a mirror, reflecting societal attitudes toward women in positions of autonomy and influence. Her intelligence, charm, and command over vast estates, once admired or at least tolerated, were recast in the lens of horror after her alleged crimes became public knowledge. The mythologized image of the vampiric countess, a figure bathing in blood, obsessed with eternal youth, and capable of unspeakable cruelty, speaks not only to fear of physical violence, but also to cultural anxieties about female authority, sexual autonomy, and the potential threat posed by a woman unbound by societal expectation. Her legend reminds us that history is rarely impartial, and that power in the hands of women has often been demonized, distorted, or sensationalized. In popular culture, Elizabeth Bathory has become a symbol of transgression, a Gothic archetype whose narrative is continually reinterpreted. She appears as a villain, anti-hero, and even as a tragic figure in literature, film, video games, and television. Each depiction underscores a fascination with her duality: beauty and cruelty, intelligence and obsession, mortality and the desire for immortality. Modern storytellers continue to mine her legend for insights into the human psyche, exploring themes that transcend historical specificity to touch universal fears and desires. In doing so, Elizabeth becomes not merely a historical curiosity, but a prism through which the human imagination examines obsession, power, and moral boundaries. The folklore surrounding her estate, Cactus Castle, adds another dimension to her legend. Tourists, historians, and thrill-seekers alike are drawn to the castle not only to witness the ruins of her once grand domain, but to feel the lingering presence of her myth. Tales of curses, ghosts, and spectral cries have persisted for centuries, embedding Elizabeth into the landscape itself. This intertwining of place and legend ensures that her story remains tangible, as though the very stones of the castle remember the shadows of her life, the fears of her victims, and the cultural imagination that has kept her alive. Elizabeth Bathory's legend also offers a lens for exploring the ethics of memory and storytelling. The line between historical fact and myth is deliberately blurred in her case, raising questions about culpability, exaggeration, and cultural storytelling. Scholars continue to debate the number of victims, the authenticity of accounts, and the motivations behind her posthumous vilification. Yet it is precisely this ambiguity that sustains fascination. The uncertainty invites reflection, discussion, and reinterpretation. Elizabeth embodies the human attraction to moral complexity, to narratives that resist simple conclusions, and to the eternal interplay between history and myth. Her story resonates because it confronts fundamental human fears: the fear of aging and death, the fear of loss of control, and the fear of cruelty unchecked by conscience or law. The mythic image of Elizabeth bathing in the blood of the young is shocking not simply because of its brutality, but because it externalizes these universal anxieties in the figure of a woman who embodies both elegance and menace. In doing so, the legend functions as both cautionary tale and psychological mirror, reflecting the dark potentials inherent in desire, obsession, and power. In the end, Elizabeth Bathory's legacy is eternal precisely because it occupies the liminal space between history and legend. She is at once a real noblewoman of early modern Hungary, a psychological study of ambition and obsession, and a mythic archetype whose story has been retold and reinvented across centuries. Her life and legend continue to illuminate the complexities of human behavior, the seductive allure of power, and the cultural need to explore transgression through narrative. The Blood Countess reminds us that some shadows cast by history are impossible to erase. They linger in ruins, in stories, in imaginations, and in the moral and psychological questions they provoke. Elizabeth Bathory's tale endures because it engages us on multiple levels: historical, cultural, psychological, and symbolic. It is a story that challenges, terrifies, and fascinates, ensuring that the Countess who once ruled through fear and authority continues to rule through legend and imagination. As we leave the echoes of Cactus Castle behind, we are reminded that history is alive not only in facts, but in memory, myth, and the human propensity to explore darkness. Elizabeth Bathory's shadow stretches far beyond her lifetime, a testament to the enduring power of narrative, the fascination with transgression, and the eternal allure of stories that linger at the edge of horror. In the story of the Blood Countess, history and legend converge, leaving us with a figure whose legacy will never fade, whose shadow will never fully lift, and whose tale will continue to haunt our collective imagination for generations to come.